Welcome back to our residency-level explainer on Otto Fenichel's psychoanalytic theory. Today, we're diving into one of the most explosive and, frankly, dangerous transitions in clinical psychology, the sudden shift from depression right into mania. If you recall from our last session, we left off with this striking image, a tiny, crushed ego completely paralyzed under the weight of an incredibly harsh, punishing superego.
Now imagine that crushing pressure just suddenly vanishes. The big question we have to ask ourselves here is, what happens to all that energy? The energy that was just being used for constant inhibition, crushing guilt, and self-attack when it's suddenly let go. When that massive psychic effort spent on self-hatred is just no longer needed, it literally busts out of its cage. And really, that's the core mystery of the manic state.
To unpack this, we're going to systematically look at the breaking of the dams, ego versus superego dynamics, the mechanism of triumph, the manic defense, modern clinical reality, and finally, extreme configurations of self-esteem.
All right, Section 1, the breaking of the dams.
We have to start with Fenichel's economic concept. Think of mental energy like water behind a massive, high-pressure dam. In a depressed state, enormous amounts of psychic energy are entirely tied up in a defensive, depressive struggle. The ego is spending absolutely everything it has just to survive the superego's attacks. But when that restraint finally crumbles, the gates fly open. All that bound-up energy is instantly available for massive discharge. The dam is officially broken.
And theoretically, this sudden breaking of the dam translates directly into the clinical realities we see on the wards. We're talking about a sudden explosion of increased activity, a deep object hunger, and profound disinhibition. Patients are rapidly engaging with people, churning out ideas, starting massive projects. Their self-esteem skyrockets, and they're filled with this unquestioned sense of limitless possibility. It's like their mental metabolism has been cranked up to an unnatural hyperspeed level.
Moving on to Section 2, let's look at the ego versus superego dynamics.
To really understand why this dam breaks, we have to look under the hood at the power struggle going on. In depression, the superego is basically omnipotent, and the ego is completely powerless, just waiting for punishment. But in mania, the polarity flips entirely. The ego regains omnipotence. It does this either by feeling like it has totally triumphed over the superego or by actually fusing with the superego's limitless power. That harsh inner critic isn't just silenced, it's completely absorbed or destroyed.
This brings us to Section 3, the mechanism of triumph.
So, what's the emotional engine driving all this manic frenzy? Fenichel defines triumph as this sudden, euphoric release of energy that was previously bound up by intense fear. When a massive threat is suddenly overcome, the ego gets this functional high, basically shouting, "I don't have to be afraid anymore. I am powerful."
Developmentally speaking, we can actually trace this feeling all the way back to infancy. Picture a tiny, helpless child in a massive world. When they finally overcome a fear, like realizing they aren't going to fall when being tossed up in the air during play, they suddenly feel like they have the exact same omnipotent mastery as the adults around them. In adulthood, this translates into an unconscious, desperate pursuit of that exact same omnipotent mastery.
Intrapsychically, this mechanism feels amazing at first. The ego gets massive relief because it's no longer burning all that energy to suppress anxiety. It feels this sudden freedom from dependence. But, and here's where the pathology really takes root, this explosive release of bound energy is actually just a desperate overcompensation against unconscious fears that haven't actually gone anywhere.
And that leads to a really crucial clinical distinction. A normal triumph happens when you actually defeat a real external threat. Your emotional response makes sense, it's proportional. A pathological manic state, on the other hand, is a cramped, forced denial of internal dependencies. The manic patient acts like they're completely free, but under the surface, those unconscious fears are still very much active. It's totally fake, a false victory.
We see this so clearly in patient presentations. Manic individuals often show this fleeting, almost festival-like elation. They'll rapidly absorb and discard objects, treating other people merely as providers of narcissistic supply. Basically, everyone just becomes an audience member for their grandiosity, without any genuine, mature attachment at all.
The profound clinical implication here is that manic elation isn't true freedom, not at all. It is a massive reaction formation. The patient hasn't genuinely escaped their punishing superego. Instead, they're maintaining this elation by aggressively denying reality, what Fenichel calls denying countercathexis. And because that core conflict is never actually resolved, there's this constant, looming threat of a devastating depressive relapse just waiting to happen.
Which takes us to Section 4, the manic defense.
In modern psychodynamic formulation, we categorize this specific, aggressive overcompensation as the manic defense. Think of it as the psychological shield. Through relentless activity, declarations of omnipotence, absolute denial, and that artificial triumph, this defense works to aggressively keep the person away from profound feelings of helplessness, dependency, grief, or guilt. Seriously, if they stop moving for even a second, the grief and guilt will catch up to them, so they just can't stop.
Let's transition to Section 5, Modern Clinical Reality. Now, we absolutely have to draw a hard, non-negotiable line between classical psychodynamic theory and our modern psychiatric reality on the wards. We must be crystal clear. Bipolar mania is a severe psychiatric syndrome with a strongly proven neurobiological basis. Yes, the psychodynamic formulation is an incredible essential tool for understanding the intrapsychic meaning behind a patient's behavior, but it absolutely does not replace the need for formal psychiatric diagnosis, medication, sleep stabilization, and standard medical care.
Because of that, it's absolutely critical we explicitly state that bipolar mania is never solely a defense against depression. While the psychological architecture of the manic defense is real and definitely shapes how the patient presents clinically, a full-blown manic episode is, at its core, a complex biological crisis that requires comprehensive medical intervention. You can't just analyze it away.
Finally, Section 6, Extreme Configurations of Self-Esteem. Let's summarize how these two states, which look so totally opposite on the outside, represent the extreme, far ends of human self-esteem. At their core, it's all about self-belief. Depression absolutely crushes the ego with the unshakable belief, I am completely worthless, creating this agonizing psychic starvation. Mania, on the flip side, falsely inflates the ego to believe, nothing can limit me. It forces the subject to consume reality itself just to prop up an illusion of absolute power.
As Fenichel so masterfully put it, both can be seen as two extreme configurations in the regulation of self-esteem and the fragile ego-superego relationship. They are quite literally two sides of the exact same coin, locked in this desperate struggle to regulate self-worth right when all the mature mental mechanisms have totally broken down.
And that leaves us with a pretty provocative question for our next explainer. In the dynamics of depression and mania, we've seen the ego fight fiercely against its own internal conflicts. But what happens when regression goes even deeper? What happens when it doesn't just stop at an ego-superego conflict, but completely dismantles reality testing and destroys the core organization of the ego itself? We're going to explore that terrifying breakdown of reality when we dive into schizophrenia next time. You definitely won't want to miss it.